The Radio Planet by Ralph Milne Farley, Chapter 20, The Wombings. Thoroughly exhausted by their flights across the boiling seas, the radio man and his two strange companions, the huge ant-man, Doggo, and the beautiful golden-furred Ver-King maiden, Quiven, wished to land at once without waiting to ascertain which particular section of Cupia lay beneath them. But the entire area below appeared to be thickly wooded. According to the fugitives, Accordingly, the fugitives hovered down to a short distance above the ground and then just skimmed along the treetops at a slow rate of speed, keeping a careful watch for a landing place. They had not long to wait, for presently they espied a road running beneath the trees, and after putting on more speed and following the road for a couple of stads, they finally came to a sufficiently large clearing in a short distance from the road to enable them to settle down quietly to the ground. The party quickly disembarked upon the silver-green sward, and the three companions then broke through the bushes to the road, which proved to be dirt, although well travelled. Miles remarked, "This must be some very out-of-the-way part of my country, for practically all of our roads are built of concrete, a material similar to the cement which I had fastened bricks together in making our furnaces in Verkingi." Quiven shuddered. "Please don't remind me of my poor city," she begged piteously. Then, in a more resigned tone, "But that is behind us. Let us forget it and face the future. You were speaking of cement roads." "Yes," Miles replied. "The fact that this road is not made of concrete indicates that it is not a main highway, but the fact that it is well worn shows that it's traveled considerably. Let us therefore wait for some passerby who can tell us where we are." At this point, Doggo produced a pad and stylus and wrote, "Let me in on this." Cabot obligingly transcribed in Peruvian shorthand an account of the conversation. Meanwhile, the golden girl abstractedly examined the foliage beside the road. While Doggo was reading the manuscript, Quiven called Cabot's attention to the trees and shrubs. "How different they are than those in Verkinia," she remarked. "That is to be expected," Miles answered, "for your land and mine are separated by boiling seas, across which no seeds or spores could pass and live. Thus it is surprising that the two continents support even the same general classes of life. Come, I'll point you out to some of the more common forms of our flora." He had a mind to show her the red-knobbled gray lichen tree, and the tartan bush, and the heart-shaped leaves of which were put to many uses by the Cupians, and the saffra herb, the roots which were used for anesthesia, and the blue and yellow dandelion-like wildflowers, but although he searched for 100 paces or so along the road, he was unable to locate a single specimen of the very common bits of Peruvian vegetation. "It is strange," he muttered half to himself. "When I want to show the common plants of Cupia, I find nothing but unfamiliar plants, and yet I'll bet that if I go out in search of a rare specimen for my castle garden at Lake Luno, I should find nothing but tartan, saffra, lichen trees, and blue dandelions." The mention of Luno Castle turned his thoughts homeward with a jerk. Here he was at last, after many adventures, on the same continent with his Lilla and his baby Q. He had come here to rescue them, if it were not too late, from Yuri the usurper and his whistling bees. Now that he was apparently within reach of his loved ones, he began to worry about their safety a great deal more than ever before. But this fear for Lilla was completely outweighed by a growing fear of Lilla. What would she say to his two allies? Doggo, an ant-man, was a representative of a race which Cabot had vowed to exterminate from the face of Poros, for, as he had repeatedly assessed, there could be no lasting peace on any continent which it was inhabited by more than one race of intelligent beings. And Quiven, the golden-furred Ver-King maiden, would be even more difficult to explain. She was beautiful, even by Cupian standards. She was more nearly the same race as Miles than his own wife, Lilla. She and Miles could talk together, unheard by the radio sense of Lilla. In these circumstances, it was hardly possible that Princess Lilla would receive Quiven with open arms, or even passably decent to her. At this point, his reveries were interrupted by Doggo handing him the following note. "If we are to wait for passer-bys, do you not think it would be well to return to the plain and secure our rifles, so as to protect ourselves in case the passer-by should be hostile?" Miles nodded his assent, and informed Quiven of their intentions. She, being nearer to the point where they had entered the road, plunged through the bush at once, and they hastened after her. Just as Miles and Doggos were breaking through the bushes in the wake of the golden one, they heard an agonized scream ahead. Redoubling their efforts, they reached the clearing in an instant, and beheld a most unexpected sight. Perched upon the airship like a flock of enormous vultures were about a dozen huge bat-winged pale green reptiles. each with a wing spread of fully 10 feet, and one of these loathsome creatures held the writhing form of Quiven tight in its claws. Without a moment's thought for his own safety, the intrepid Earthman drew the Verkinian sword which hung at his side, and rushed straight at the beast which held the girl. Doggo followed close behind, clicking his mandibles angrily. But before they could reach the plain, the noisome flock flapped heavily into the air and disappeared over the trees to the northward, Quiven's childish face of agony in despair, and one little furry paw waving a forlorn farewell. The next move was obvious. Miles and Doggo sprang to their places in the aircraft and soared after. It was an easy matter to overtake the clumsy winged saurians, but not so easy to decide what to do after reaching them. The reptiles flew so close together their pursuers were afraid to fire on them for fear of hitting Quiven. The girl was as yet apparently unharmed, so the only thing to do seemed to be to follow and watch for some opportunity to effect a rescue. Thus the chase continued for several stads without event. Miles was in agony over the safety of his little friend, but even his deep concern did not keep his scientific mind from speculating about these pale green dragons which he was following. He had read about such beasts in books on paleontology as a child. These were undoubtedly pterodactyls. He had seen somewhat similar stuffed specimens in the Imperial Museum at Kuana, capital of Cupia. He had encountered swarms of tiny tetrasaurs, the size of sparrows in the caves of Kar, but he had been informed by Cupian scientists that the larger species had long since been extinct on Poros. Whence had then these captors of Quiven? While engaged thus in speculations, he flew a bit closer to the flock, where at two of them suddenly turned and simultaneously attacked the plane from both sides. Doggo instantly dispatched his assailant with a rifle shot, but Miles did not dare let go of the central controls, for he was flying too close to the treetops for safety as it was. Accordingly, his assailant got a claw hold on the side of the fuselage, furled its wings, and started to crawl in. But the Earthman steered the machine high into the air as his companion swung around and fired at the intruder, which promptly let go of its hold and, falling with a shriek of pain, crashed through the treetops and disappeared from view. Miles drew a deep breath of relief, and once more swooped down on the flock of the tetrasaurs. But this time he kept at a safe distance between them, and they, warned by the fate of the comrades, did not attempt any further sallies about the plain. So the pursuit continued. Occasionally between the green wings, the two in the airship could catch a glimpse of the form of Quiven held fast in the talons of her captor. She was still alive. She did not seem to be in pain. Once she waved feebly to her friends above. What would those beasts do with her? The question was soon to be answered, but first it was to be succeeded by many other questions, for a large and prosperous-looking city loomed ahead, its appearance unfamiliar to Cabot. Strange, he thought he knew all the principal settlements of Cupia. Its architecture was an unknown type, not the Pueblo-like piles of exaggerated toy-building blocks affected by the Formians, nor the red-tiled spirals and minarets of the Cupians, but rather a style somewhat resembling classical Greek or Roman. The architecture was immaterial, however, compared with the fact that this was a city of some sort, a city of high degree of civilization. The beasts were apparently headed straight forward, and thus there was every prospect of the inhabitants, presumably Cupians, helping to rescue Quiven. Suppose, however, it was a deserted city. Its unfamiliar style and remote location suggested as much. Perhaps this was the long-forgotten court of some Cupian jamshard, now kept by a lion and lizard, or rather woofus and pterodactyls. This was not so, however, for as Cabot drew near he could clearly see that the buildings were in excellent states of repair, with not a rumbling ruin among them. No, this was an inhabited city, to which the green dragons were bringing their prey. Could it be that the Cupian inhabitants kept creatures as pets, and this fact was unknown to the scientists at the Cupian metropolis? Cogitations were again cut short by their arrival over the city. The dragons made straight for an imposing central-located dome edifice, which they entered by one of the upper windows. The plane promptly dropped to a nearby plaza. Making a sign to the Ant-Man to guard the ship, Miles seized a rifle and some cartridges and rushed down the street which led toward the building which the green beasts had entered. On the way he met several tetrasaurs, 4 or 5 four-legged, slate-colored reptiles ranging in size and form from a small dog to that of a horse, one large snake about 30 feet in length, various sorts of insects, and a few cat-like furry creatures, but not a single Cupian. If these were the pets of the city, where were the masters? The strange creatures did not offer to molest him. In fact, they gave way to him with every indication of respect and not a little fear. This seemed to indicate that they were all thoroughly domesticated, so he made no effort to hurt them. At last he arrived at a building which he had sought. A wide incline led from the street up to the arched doorway. This smacked of Formia, for the ant-men, before they were driven off the continent, had used ramps everywhere instead of the flight of stairs that were employed by Cupians. Over the door was an inscription in the unmistakable Peruvian characters, "The Palace of the City of Yat." This must be Cupia or Old Formia, now occupied by the Cupians, for this was the language of those two races. But then he reflected it had also been the written language of the Kings, far across the boiling seas. Putting an end to his speculations, he rushed up the ramp and entered the building. The splendidly arched and vaulted interior was crowded with the strangest assortment of animals the Earthman had ever set eyes upon. Picture to yourself Frank Buck's circus, the New York Zoo, or the Gruel of the Koana, all turned loose in some one hall, and then you wouldn't imagine one half of it, for very few of the assembled beasts bore any slight resemblance to anything which you, or even Miles Cabot, had ever seen. He paused aghast and surveyed the assemblage. There was not a human or Cupian present, nor even an ant-man. At the farther side of the chamber, on a raised platform, there sat, or rather squatted, a gigantic pterosaur, whose wing spread must have been at least 20 feet from tip to tip. This beast, unlike those which had kidnapped Quiven, was a pale slate blue rather than green. His head was square, with a sharp crusted beak, large circular lidless eyes, and ear holes, but no ears. 4 legs he had, very much like those of a toad, except that the 5th finger of each hand, the finger which should have been the little finger, extended backward over his hips to a distance about 6 feet and served as the other supporting edge of his leathery wings, which now lay furled at his side. In front of this creature stood Quiven the Golden Flame, guarded by 2 of the similar pterodactyls, and seemingly unhurt and unafraid. None of the animals appeared to have noticed Cabot's entrance, so he decided to wait a few moments and size up the situation before doing anything too rash. As he watched the scene, a huge snake some 30 feet in length and at least half a yard in diameter squirmed up on the platform beside the slate-colored dragon. This snake had 2 rudimentary legs and 2 small arms, none of which it used to help its progression, but in one hand it carried what appeared to be a sheet of paper, which it handed with a hiss to the dragon, who hissed in reply, then taking the paper appeared to read it. This called the attention of the Earthman to what fact that each of the Alice in Wonderland-like creatures about him was indeed equipped with a pad and stylus. Occasionally one would scratch something on the pad and then make 2 sharp clicks with its mouth, at which a small winged lizard would take the missive and fly with it to some other part of the chamber. Standing very near Miles, there was a small and particularly inoffensive-looking furry animal, somewhat resembling a beaver. In Cupia, Miles would have assumed that there was some species of mathlab, except that it had a lack of antenna. This looked like a safe, good specimen to experiment upon, so he reached for its pad, which, to his great surprise, the creature promptly handed him without demur, together with the stylus. Remembering the inscription above the arched doorway, Miles wrote in Peruvian shorthand, "Most excellent King, Miles Cabot, a weary sojourner, craves protection for himself and the Golden One who now stands before you. We are from Cupia and Verkingi, respectively. What country is this?" Then he folded the paper and clicked twice with his tongue against the roof of his mouth. Instantly a fluttering messenger was at his side, indicating the platform with a gesture. He handed the note to the little winged reptile, who flew away with it. Miles passed the pad and stylus back to the furry creature, from whom he had borrowed it, and then watched the great dragon, to whom he had written. This beast received and read the note, while the messenger hovered an eye. Then, steadying a pad against the floor with one front claw, he wrote on it with a stylus held in the other. What had he written? He showed to the snake, which lay coiled beside him, and upon obtaining a hiss of approval, folded the note and gave it to the little bat, who flew back with it to Miles. On the paper, written in unmistakable Peruvian characters, were the words, "Welcome to Yet, Miles Cabot. You and your mate are our guests. We know of no country of either Cupia or Verkingi. This is the land of Wumangs, and I am Boomalala, their king. You have permission to approach the throne." So that explained the strange plants, and dirt roads, and unfamiliar architecture in the absence of any Cupians or Verakings. This must be a third continent, intermediate between the other two. While the plain was intact, and King Boomalala had assured him they were guests, so that was just as well as they had landed on the Azores of the boiling seas. Reassured, the Earthman made his way through the strange throng to the front of the throne, where he bowed low before the hideous reptile monarch. Little Quiven, with a cry of glad surprise, rushed over to him and nestled confidently by his side. Placing one arm protectively around her, he boldly confronted the winged king. This beast, after some penciled conversation with his serpent adviser, handed Miles a note reading as follows: "Our nation was formed many years ago by a creature closely resembling yourself. Therefore you are an honored guest among us. We have long awaited this day. It is true that you have killed the bodies of two of my subjects, and thereby subjugated their souls to premature birth. The penalty for this would be, ordinarily, to have a similar death imposed upon your own body. But because of your resemblance to our great originator, Nalump, I shall spare your body. Furthermore, I fear that, like him, you may perhaps have no soul, although this deficiency can easily be supplied." Miles read the note and handed it to Quiven, then pointed to the writing materials of the Sarin. Instantly the two of the tiny winged messengers brought him a pad and stylus. Thus supplied, he asked the king: "Great ruler, does your offer of protection include my wings and the black creature who guards them in the public square outside?" "And how about little me?" asked Quiven, reading over his shoulder. "He already pledged his friendship to both of us," replied Miles, handing a note to one of the tiny tetrasaurs. Back came the answer from the king: "Yes, all of yours shall be protected. I will now send guards to relieve your guard at the wings, and to summon him into my presence." But the Earthman held up a hand in gesture of protest and hurriedly wrote: "You better not, your majesty, unless you wish a fight. I will send a note explaining all. You can then follow it in a few paras with your detachment of guards." To this proposal the huge Sauron assented, so Miles dispatched to Doggo by one of the tiny tetrasaurs a long written explanation of the situation. A few minutes later, under orders from the Reptile King, the flock of green pterodactyls who had been the original captors of Quiven departed with much leathery flapping through one of the windows overhead, and presently one of them returned on foot with Doggo. "What kind of a gruel have we got ourselves into?" were the Ant-Man's first words, as Cabot handed him the pad and stylus. "The great builder only knows," his friend replied. "Anyhow, they claim to possess souls and have offered us protection." Doggo looked skeptical, but then a messenger flitted over with a note from Boomalala, reading: "The session is at an end. You will please follow me to the royal apartments for a conference." The king clicked sharply. Instantly all was silence in the huge hall. Solemnly the king clicked 3 times. In unison the assembled Wumangs clicked back a triple answer. Then all was bustle and confusion, as those without wings crowded through the doors, and those with wings departed through the windows in the dome above. Boomalala and his snake adviser, and the 3 travelers from Verkingi were the only persons, if you can call them all persons, left in the vaulted chamber. Whereupon the snake, gliding ahead, led the way to an anteroom, gorgeously jeweled and draped. There the 5 reclined on soft tapestries, attended by a swarm of little messengers, and engaged in the following written conversation. Due to the speed of Peruvian shorthand, the talk progressed practically at the rapidity as if it had been spoken, although Doggo was somewhat handicapped by not having a stylus, which was properly adapted to his claw. "Who are your companions?" the king asked. So Miles introduced Quiven and the Ver-King maiden, and Doggo the Formian. Boomalea explained that the snake was Queekle Mookie, prime minister of the Wumangs, and wise beyond all the other countrymen. "His soul is brother to my soul, although our bodies are unrelated," the king wrote. Miles was much perplexed. "How is it," he inquired, "that such diversified animals as you Wumangs were able to live at peace with each other?" "It was not so before the days of Nalump," the huge tetrasaur replied, "but he gave us souls and made us one people. Our bodies may be unrelated, but our souls are the same. You and your 2 companions are as unlike as any of us. Perhaps the 3 of you have a common type of soul." Miles was even more perplexed. Who was no lump, he asked. And what means all this talk of souls?